It's only when you get to the extreme cases, such as when the brain stops functioning, that you see the analogy breaking down. And brain and mind do not seem to be the same thing. The most common example that's talked about now is the near-death experience, where you have people, many people who seem to be clinically dead, a few people who've actually had flat brainwaves documented, who come back saying, not only was I thinking, but I was thinking more clearly than I ever had before. But we also have other examples of cases in which, when the brain is compromised, people think more clearly. There are exceptional cases of people who have irreversible dementia or severe mental illness, who in their dying moments before they die become perfectly lucid. They start recognizing family members, they start talking coherently, they lose their delusions, and then they die. What is that all about? We don't have a materialistic explanation for this. If you assume that mind and brain can separate when the brain starts to deteriorate, then you have an explanation. You can't do a lot of research on that type of experience. Those are just isolated anecdotes, and believe me, they are unusual. Most people who die with dementia. They don't come out of it. But we have these isolated cases that tell us something else is going on. But with the near-death experience, we have a potentially researchable lab to look at what's happening when the brain goes down. Now, we have ways of extending the life of the brain, for example, by hypothermia, by giving it different drugs to reduce its need for oxygen so it can keep going for longer. And you can argue about how dead is dead. But as Sam Parney mentioned this morning, if you get down to the point where you have an isolated neuron, an isolated nerve cell still functioning, does it make sense to say that neuron is hungry or is angry or has consciousness? We don't think so. How about if you have two cells connected together? Can they be hungry? Most neuroscientists think you need an entire intact neural network to have anything like consciousness. And clearly that is not going on when you have perhaps some rudimentary brain activity in the deep brainstem. Whatever you have, if you have any brain activity, it's not what we usually think is required for consciousness. So we have brains that are not functioning well enough to produce consciousness, and yet we have people saying, I was conscious throughout the whole procedure. In fact, I was more clear then than when I'm stuck back here in the brain with all the limitations of the brain on me. Is there anything that's verifiable in all this? We have people saying to us, yes, I was thinking clearer than ever before, that was more real than this. How do we know that there's anything to any of this? Well, occasionally people bring back from a near-death experience some verifiable information. And this is the same thing that Sam is trying to do with this AWARE study, trying to put targets that are unexpected in places where people can see when they leave their bodies. And we have lots of anecdotes of people who have done this, who have said, yes, I left my body and I saw Dr. So-and-so kick over the stand, or I saw this or that, and they're accurate. And sometimes they are very surprising things that they report to us, things they couldn't possibly have guessed. We also have people bringing back from a near-death experience information they couldn't have gotten about other things as well. Sometimes they have met and communicated with deceased loved ones who have told them information that they couldn't have gotten in other way. There are cases of people who have met these deceased loved ones that no one knew had died. And we have many cases that documented this where people who talked about seeing deceased relatives included Uncle Joe, who everyone thought was still alive. And you didn't find out until days later that Uncle Joe had died a few minutes before this person has near-death experience. How do we explain these things in terms of neurological function? So these are ways in which, from a near-death experience, you can get some verifiable information, which can bear on the question of, are these things, quote, real? Obviously, they're real for the experiencer and for people who interact with the experiencer. I have the luxury of working with physicians. And you heard Jeffrey Schwartz this morning tell about the animosity that you sometimes face from scientists when you challenge their materialistic beliefs. I've seen that happen among a lot of basic scientists. I haven't seen it so much among clinicians, among practicing physicians. And here I really resonate with Esther Sternberg's hopefulness about where the future of medicine is going. Because doctors are much more like engineers than they are like scientists. They care about what works. You know, the scientist wants to know, what's the theory behind this? If you don't have a theory for it, I'm not going to pay any attention to it. Where's your theory to combat materialism? You don't have one? Forget it. Doctors won't do that. Doctors will say, if it helps the patient, I'll use it, whether I understand it or not. So we have something that is very real for the patients and very real for the physicians who take care of them. And with the objective measures we're getting now from studies like the one Sam is doing, we can have some more objective, verifiable information, which hopefully will convince the others in the scientific world that this is something that needs to be explained. We have lots of data that materialistic science can't explain. I have here a book called Irreducible Mind, which my colleagues published last year. 800 very densely packed pages of scientific data from the world of medicine that do not fit into the materialistic model. Things from psychosomatic medicine, from faith healing, from placebos, from hypnotic effects, to near-death experiences. Things that cannot be explained by materialistic worldview. What is the materialistic scientist's answer to this? These are anecdotes. They're isolated facts. And that's all we have until we have a comprehensive theory to explain it. And I think that is partly why you see the animosity that Jeff was talking about this morning. We don't have a good competing theory. Now, Sam talked this morning about dualism, which is an alternative to monistic materialism, but there are lots of problems with that. When you get right down to it, dualism has just as many problems as materialism does. We simply don't have the explanation. I would argue, though, that we have enough data now that we need to start looking for the explanation. I think it goes deeper than just our language. There's a problem in how the culture makes us think that distorts how we describe things. As Sam mentioned this morning, so much of the way we think about things came from the ancient Greeks. And in fact, our system of logic, of how we deal with ideas, is determined by Aristotle's, it's called a twofold system of logic, where things are either true or false. He postulated the law of the excluded middle. Things can't be both true and false. They have to be true or false. And that type of logic leads us to have what we've called mysteries, things we can't explain. So we can choose between trying to reduce them to things we can't explain or saying, it's a mystery, we can't solve it. That's because we're locked into this yes or no law of the excluded middle. Other cultures don't have this. There is a Hindu system of logic that was developed by Nagarjuna, in which there are 4 different types of logical statements. Things can be true, or they can be false, or they can be true and false, or they can be neither true nor false. And all those are logical statements in their system. And when you think about what physics is doing these days, remember what Henry was talking about this morning. We have things that don't fit into our logic. So philosophers can say, well, quantum physics is illogical. Maybe it is by Aristotelian logic, but not necessarily by another type of logic. Is a photon a wave or a particle? According to Aristotle, it has to be one or the other. It can't be both. But in other forms of logic, it can be both or it can be neither. So maybe what science has to do, what scientists have to do, is get beyond our own prejudices and start using not only other languages, but other ways of evaluating the language, other ways of thinking.